Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of On Being Human Conversations. I am very excited about being here today and looking forward to engaging with our host. Today's talk is on empowering your mind, founders' mental health. And I have a really special guest who will be joining me today. Her name is Onkgopotse Khumalo. Where we will really be unpacking mental health issues amongst entrepreneurs within entrepreneurship and founders. So I'll be chatting to her about her experiences as a tech founder, as someone who started their own business, and just what the journey has been like. So these conversations form part of the work that I do when I'm not on my couch, and I'm really looking forward to this because this is a topic that's close to my heart as well. I am a clinical psychologist, practicing clinical psychologist. I was well trained in clinical expertise, but I would say that I had to learn a lot of entrepreneurial skills along the way and business skills along the way to really just forge that gap that existed in my training. And I've been doing this work for some years now, and I've just found it really meaningful and insightful to engage with entrepreneurs, people who are building their own businesses. And in my experience, I've found that a lot of mental health conditions exist within the entrepreneurship space, and yet we don't speak about it enough. So I ask you to grab your teas, your coffees, and some water, and really just join us in this conversation. Please feel free to ask questions at any point during the talk. I just urge you to submit your questions as we go along the conversation, and then our guest will address the questions towards the end. But before we get into it, let me just tell you a little bit more about our guest. Onkgopotse Khumalo is a dynamic entrepreneur with a proven track record in healthcare and business. She successfully co-founded a medical facility, MediWell, in Dainfin, and she is tackling the mental health crisis in Africa head-on with a health tech startup called Amari Health, which was previously known as the Pocket Couch. And Amari Health has made significant strides, providing access to nearly 100,000 therapy minutes in 6 South African languages. And she has a network provider of over 20 diverse mental health care experts. And recently, through this work, she was honored with the Mental Health Game Changer Award at the prestigious Glamour Women of the Year 2024 Awards. So she's deeply passionate about transforming the mental health landscape by bridging the access gap, by providing culturally competent solutions and building for people and communities, not just to thrive, but to survive. She, however, prides herself the most in her role as a mother to her 4-year-old son, and she considers herself a certified toddler as one of her most exciting accolades. And I must say that should actually be a certificate of managing a toddler. So I'm really excited to speak to Onkgopotse. But before we bring her on, maybe let me start by sharing some really important stats when it comes to entrepreneurship, mental health, and founders' health. So what the research is telling us and the stats are telling us is that 72% of entrepreneurs report having mental health conditions, compared to only 48% of non-entrepreneurs. And so 30% of founders have experienced depression, anxiety, which is more than double the rate seen in the general population. And entrepreneurs are twice as likely to suffer from stress-related conditions, and they're 10 times more likely to suffer from bipolar disorder than the general population. And this month, September, is Suicide Prevention Month. And it's important for me to note this as well, because we are speaking about mental health conditions. And the research is telling us when it comes to founders, they are twice as likely to experience suicidal thoughts as compared to the general population, um, and that entrepreneurs are 2 times more likely to have a history of substance abuse, which is linked to the toll of managing extreme stress and pressure. But with all these stats that we're seeing, we can hear that there's a serious crisis. I would say that there's a real pandemic with mental health within the entrepreneurship space. But with all of these stats, only 20% of entrepreneurs seek professional help. And this is often due to stigma, lack of resources, as well as perception. And I'm really wanting to unpack further with my guest this evening around where her mind is at, what her experiences have been, and her thoughts around all that I've just sort of laid the foundation for. So, Onkgopotse, let's bring you on and let you introduce yourself and you tell our audience who you are and a little bit about the work that you do.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be in the space. If you have been following me, you know that founder mental health is something that I'm quite passionate about. I've had a couple of conversations that have been streamed around the topic. So yeah, I'm obviously Onkgopotse Khumalo. You pretty much synthesized a lot of my profile, but yeah, I'm just very deeply passionate about creating access to mental health care support in a way that's super convenient, culturally sensitive, and cost effective. And it's really something that emanates from my personal experience as well, struggling with anxiety and burnout, working in a really high, fast-paced, high-performing culture in both the financial services sector and then later on management consulting. And that kind of really sparked a passion around, starting or building something in the solution space around this. And obviously, you mentioned something around diversity, our diverse network of psychologists, etc. That's super important to us. Recognizing, or you would know as well, recognizing the importance of, having someone on the other side of the table or the screen who can resonate with your lived experience. For some people, that's super important in their therapeutic process. And also linguistic, are important. Linguistics are important. Some people prefer to relate in their mother tongue. And we really, really are passionate about not making sure that that isn't a hurdle. There's so many hurdles already to accessing mental health care. So insofar as we can, eliminate some, that's a major win for us. I was born and raised in Johannesburg, studied in Cape Town, similar to you. That's me. I don't know what else. Do you think people would want to know?
Well, I think that you've shared a little, a bit more, much more about the work that you do and how you started, your business in healthcare, etc. And I suppose I just want to thank you for spending time with us this evening and really opening yourself up to speak about a topic that not a lot of people are willing to speak about and really put themselves out there and say, I too have struggled and I'm finding my way in all of this. But you, just to go back to what you shared in your introduction, you spoke about what led you to starting a healthcare sort of tech startup. Can you maybe tell me a little bit more, or tell us a little bit more about what unexpected psychological changes have you faced while building this startup?
Sure. Where to even begin? There's like a plethora of things that I could talk about. But I think I think about, like, I kind of frame this around like the weight of entrepreneurship. And I think there's three things for me that I've really tried to navigate and that have had an impact on my mental health. And the first is, I would say, the weight of comparison. And so in the, startup, especially the tech startup space, there's a lot of expectation around, how quickly you should build, how much money you should raise by when, how much AI you're integrating into your platform. There's a lot of kind of expectation from the ecosystem. And of course, there is some personal responsibility to be taken around the expectation we place on ourselves. But that's been difficult to navigate, and trying to make my peace with the fact that, it's not a linear journey to success, and success means different things to different people. So oftentimes that has kind of made me quite anxious around, like, am I doing this fast enough? Like, is this innovative enough, and is it impactful enough? And then the second thing is like the weight of responsibility. So, when you start building a team, anyone who's hired people will know, it's so important that you focus on building a sustainable business. It's extra important, right? Because when you then start to, take on the responsibility for paying people, you're literally taking on the responsibility of their family's livelihood, their livelihood. And thinking about that is super nerve-wracking. I mean, today is, or yesterday or today, it's roughly around payday, right? So people expect to get paid, right? And for many founders, this is an incredibly stressful time, right? Like, you've got to pay, and sometimes you don't pay yourself, like whether or not that's the principle you adopt. And so that weight of responsibility is a lot. And then I would say the third one is like the weight of um, thinking about the opportunity cost. So for me, I think every now and then I think about how, like, I could be earning so much more money, as like some, middle to senior manager in a bank or whatever. And so much more predictable, so much more, I suppose, so much more palatable for my parents who think entrepreneurship, even though my mom's an entrepreneur, they obviously don't fully understand why I've taken the risk. So there's just a lot of weight around it. And for me personally, how that manifests is as like anxiety. And so I really try and be intentional about navigating certain things in those spaces so that I can be less anxious about them.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sure. And you're bringing up something that I've been curious about. Well, two things based off your experience is, well, the first one is, I suppose I'm curious about whether at all you feel there is a taboo within the startup space to actually say, I am struggling. Um, and I am struggling to keep up with this fast-paced environment. Um, and what are the implications of that within that sort of ecosystem when an entrepreneur actually puts themselves out there and says, I can't, I can't keep up, or I'm struggling in a particular way.
Yeah, that's really it's a really good point to make. There was a recent startup, a health and performance high impact entrepreneurs report, I think it was called, and it touches on the fact that more than half of founders find discussions around mental health taboo in the ecosystem. And so it's a really big problem, right? It's asking ourselves why. And I think there's a couple of things, but I'll kind of synthesize. I think the first thing is the perception, and in some ways it is founded, that, you know, opening up around your mental health and the fact that you might be struggling is directly correlated to your ability to deliver and perform. And I think it's not just a common thing in the entrepreneurial landscape, but just generally as well for professionals. And that is a function of the I think the culture that we build, right? I think oftentimes we forget that entrepreneurs are actually human, right? They're building ventures, yes, but there's a human behind the venture. And so we are expected to be this like output driven machine, just constantly meeting milestones, constantly raising capital. And so the fear is that, being vulnerable would create a signal or perception that you're not able to deliver. I think that's the main thing. I would say the second thing is like lack of support infrastructure. I think while the workplace environment, traditional workplace environment, has really caught on, obviously there's much work to be done around the importance of employee mental well-being. The general structure of the ecosystem, the entrepreneurial ecosystem, tech ecosystem specifically, hasn't really it hasn't really permeated. At least that's my perception. And I think it's the lack of understanding that this community is so important in fostering people's, mentally healthier people in that community. And until we kind of create structures that allow for that sense of vulnerability in the community, that it's really going to be difficult, because you can't normalize discussions if you're not like creating safe spaces and communities for people to have those discussions. And so, yeah, I think, and then obviously this kind of conversation and discourse is super important, because the more you kind of have conversations, the more you begin to normalize something that is seemingly taboo. But yeah, I think those are the first two things are probably some of the major reasons why it is difficult. Yeah.
Mm. So, I get the sense that there's something very distinct about the entrepreneurship space when it comes to productivity and delivery, which I think takes on a very different feel for me when comparing it to traditional corporate structures, where I often find and see that there's this pressure to be almost not human and be invincible and produce and be seen as productive and be seen as signing deals, to be seen as fundraising and doing all these sort of rounds of fundraising. So to be seen to perform. And I think that it does take on a very particular feel for me in the entrepreneurship space. I'm curious about what you think about that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's definitely this notion that founders are superheroes, or that they have superpowers, and entrepreneurs are like superhuman. And I think you're absolutely right. There is that sentiment. But I think to some degree, look, it goes both ways. To some degree, we perpetuate that narrative by not having, open conversation, even as founders, around what we're struggling with. And then, of course, it is, the ecosystem around entrepreneurship that then also may not facilitate or allow for those kind of vulnerable discussions to happen. But I read something that's super interesting just on that. And I'll just read it out, which basically speaks to your testament or your sentiment. It says, um, every entrepreneur has heard the advice to fake it till you make it. After all, we need to exude confidence in what we're building to bring partners, employees, investors, and our own families along the ride. Um, and besides that, we're all shaped by our own internal narrative. So the stories we tell ourselves can be a precious source of stamina in the face of adversity. And I think it speaks to the stories we tell ourselves, right? I think we as well tell ourselves these stories that we should be infallible. But like I said, it's also a function of what we perceive or what we see online. We're so quick to celebrate people who are, bashing the milestones and who are really killing it. And so far, it will perceive we create the impression that they're killing it. But we're very quick to cast judgment when people quote unquote fail, right? So you will have seen that it's been quite a difficult climate for a lot of African tech startups that have shut down in the last year or so, and investment slowed over a period of time. And there's a lot of criticism around that, which in some cases is fair because you have investors who've lost money. In some cases, it's been avoidable, but we're not really giving people a platform to speak about how they failed and what the impact it had on them, and how they're navigating that, or how they then navigated it. We really over-index on success stories, which I think just further exacerbates the narrative that founders have superpowers. And I think to some degree, you have to kind of tap into some element of superpowers. But like you said, there's a human behind the venture, and sometimes we forget that.
Mm. And I think for me, in the work that I do, I think that what's concerning about that sort of projection of success is that there's a missed opportunity to learn from experience, to learn from your failures. So if we are projecting only success stories, then the implication is that we're not hearing voices of people that have learned valuable lessons. Because what we know is that psychologically, the best teacher is experience. You have a 4-year-old, right? And what he will learn is not what you tell him, but actually what he sees, what you model, what he sees in his environment, and through experience. Um, and I think that that sort of makes me think about how there is such a missed opportunity to really hear stories of lessons, and that also by doing that or by not doing that, the implication there is that you're not harnessing an important psychological skill, which is learning from experience, and really pausing and reflecting on, okay, what does this all mean for me? What can I learn about myself? What can I learn about business? What do I want going forward? Because it's in those moments of pause and reflection that you're able to really connect with yourself internally. And so if there's this pressure to succeed and produce all the time, then it begs the question of, when do you reflect? When do you think? When do you really ideate in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And you touched on something that's really important in the sense that me and my fellow founders, some of my founders in the tech space, we often talk about how this is a really character building experience, right? And I think what you've just sparked in my mind is like reframing how we can potentially reframe just building the venture, hitting the milestones, to actually like developing our character, right? So we're building our ventures, yes, but we're also developing our character, learning to navigate uncertainty. That in and of itself is such a powerful tool. But because we aren't able to necessarily quantify it, we then minimize its value. But being a founder requires such a level of comfort with ambiguity that you just really, it's difficult to get elsewhere. It requires a sense of, um, I suppose, wearing as many hats, while still trying to focus in a way that is difficult to find elsewhere. So I think it's important to also think about, not just the quantitative milestones that you can derive from building a venture, but just the qualitative ones as well, insofar as it relates to building yourself.
Mm. Sure, that's so true, Onkgopotse. You bring up something that I often speak about around. One of the psychological skills in entrepreneurship is your capacity to sit with discomfort and paradoxes, and managing uncertainty, and being comfortable with the not known, and the unknown. But I suppose I think that when we instill and encourage this culture of go, 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 then it doesn't allow for people to really stretch that yeah, stretch their ability to deal with that uncertainty. And I would say that I think that's why there was such a lot of people struggled during COVID. It was really about a struggle as humans to really sit with ourselves, but also not knowing, the not knowing, because we are very as human beings. Our narcissism is that we know it all, isn't it? But
So
Onkgopotse,
true.
I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier on, and a trend that I've also started seeing, right? Which I think it is fueled by this need to project this fast-paced way of working and project the sense that I'm producing, I'm hitting those milestones, as you've said, which is virtue signaling. I'm now seeing this trend, on social media, etc., where there is this rise in certain, public figures or business owners who publicly showcase, what they're doing or their social responsibility. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are on that because I'm quite skeptical about it, if I must be honest.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question and insight, right? So I think it's very look. I think that it's a double-edged sword. Just in the sense that on the one end, at the very least, more people are talking about mental health. Whatever their motivations are, whether genuine or not, they're talking about it, and we speak about kind of how do we begin to dismantle these stereotypes and stigmas around mental health if we're not encouraging discourse. So I think that that's kind of still a win. But on the other hand, I think I think it's important then to also have discernment as well around what sources of information you take in insofar as what's genuine and what's not. You can tell if you kind of take a step back if somebody's just like posting stuff for clout or versus if somebody's doing it because they have a real understanding and care for the subject matter. I think in the case of employers, it's that's where you like you're saying it rings quite true because some employers really are doing it as a checkbox exercise. It's trendy, I suppose, but I think then it comes back to us as innovators in the space and you as professionals in the space to kind of really try and um, sell the benefit in a way that's digestible for business. And that's something that's really difficult to do because it's difficult to quantify what your return on investment will be very practically if you invest in your people insofar as mental well-being is concerned. We're doing that more. There's on our website, we actually have a loss calculator, which basically shows how much you potentially are losing by not investing in your team's mental health. But if we can create more compelling, business cases around investment in mental health and what it can do, then I think people will start to buy into it authentically. Be that as it may, it's incredibly difficult as somebody who does sell to businesses and organizations. It's really not easy because I think people also really, we as people love the instant gratification, right? Like you want to see like an instant change in your employee if you invest in some sort of mental health program, not realizing that it's an investment, right? It's a long-term investment, but the payoff over time is a lot higher. Thinking about the opportunity cost of not investing in mental health, having a higher staff turnover rate, having people who show up to work but don't really produce optimally. I think you really have to try and convince people to be long-term investors, if you will. And then it begins to, I think, come from a place of authenticity. And then the one thing I will say, I know this is a very long way to answer the question. The one thing I'll also say is that I think it's also important for people to realize that mental health is not just bringing a program into your work space or your team, and then washing your hands off the responsibility. It's also like having progressive parenting policies. It's making sure that you have reasonable expectations around your employees' work hours. It's making sure that you have boundaries so that you're not, rashing your team members on a Sunday. It's a function of various things. And I think taking on that responsibility and acknowledging that as a leader is also super important, because you can have all the mental well-being programs and embedded in your policies and your business, but if you're not framing the infrastructure in a way that promotes positive well-being, it's actually not going to yield any fruit.
Mm. I really like that. I like that the idea that mental health is not just a once-off sort of program or tick box exercise that you offer to your employees and organizations. That it's actually quite dynamic, and it's ongoing, and it's individuals and organization need to go through that process of really practicing what works for them, what doesn't work for them, what works for you as an employee, what works for you as a founder. Um, and I really like that to think of it as a dynamic process. It's not a once-off thing that you do, because that's part of what I sometimes see in the work that I do is that there is someone will walk in, an entrepreneur will walk in, and they'll just sort of say, okay, tell me what to do, and for me to get out of this dark cloud or dark space, um, just tell me what to do. And I, more times than not, and I have to say, unfortunately, it isn't just go and do this and that. You have to figure out what works for you, what techniques work for you, what habits can you start adopting every day, not just when you're in crisis, because when you're in crisis, you're not learning anything. You are in a very hyper aroused state, and your mind can't process that. Your brain doesn't work like that. When you're in a hyper aroused state, you enter a survivor mode. And when you enter that sort of survival zone, your brain operates in a way that says, okay, all I need to do here is to survive. And when you're constantly operating from that place, then it doesn't allow you to tap into, sort of higher grade skills or psychological skills.
Sure, that's so good. I think for me, the idea or this notion around being in a hyper aroused state is something I've been so curious about. That your dysregulated nervous system, and you're the expert. But I think, yeah, it's difficult because I feel like as a founder, like I'm always in a hyper aroused, like dysregulated state, right? Like, because there's so much going on all of the time. And I think that's why, you know, tapping into therapy for me personally is always just something that I find so valuable, because it really forces me to step away from the state of like constant thinking and pushing for output and trying to problem solve, because the problems are many. You're going to be in that state. But I also think you touched on something that's really powerful, which is around like what works for one might not necessarily work for another. And a lot of the time, I think we try and like overgeneralize what mental health support and what the toolkit should look like, because it's sometimes, sometimes certain modalities of therapy don't work for different people, and sometimes journaling doesn't work for different people. I, for one, don't like journaling. I think I find
Wow.
it incredibly difficult. Yeah, we're gonna go into a session, a live session. Um, I find journaling difficult because, and maybe it's because of the era we're in, where everything is kind of digital. So like I have to, if I tried journaling, like writing things down, I got too distracted. I tried journaling in my notes app. I got even more distracted because I'm looking at these email notifications come in. So I take voice notes. I do voice notes. That's like I do a voice journal. So that works better for me. I think, and then some people don't do well in group settings, so they won't necessarily be vulnerable in group therapy. And that's part of what we're trying to build at Amari is more a holistic set of tools for people to tap into based on their unique preferences and needs, with an appreciation that people, process differently. People respond to different things differently, and different things are important to different people. While cultural competence or sensitivity might be important to one, it maybe isn't so important to another. And so I think that personalization element, which you touched on, is brilliant, and it does speak to what we're trying to build.
I mean, I must say, it sounds like it's quite a mammoth task, Onkgopotse, dealing with having to deal with all that personalized nature of mental health. Which I imagine as a business, you've chosen, I would say, you've chosen quite a hard path, a hard business to follow. Because also with mental health and being a healthcare professional, there's so many, regulations. We're heavily regulated, and rightfully so, to protect patients, to protect clients, and so on. So I must give you kudos for taking this courageous business step, because I imagine you would have had other business ideas, right? Other business ideas that you could have gone down the route of actually developing and growing. And it sounds to me that this is something that is not just the finances, the numbers look good, but it's also something that moves you internally and speaks to your heart.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think I always, there's times when I ponder, like, why didn't I just choose something else? Like, because it's it's something that you almost have to convince people that they might need, which is such a gray area. Like, there's some things that people just know they need. Like if they don't have electricity, they know they need electricity, so they'll get electricity. But it's like sometimes it's like tapping into people's blind spots because you don't know what you don't know. And that's such a difficult sell. I grapple with it every day. It's also not a sexy sell. You know what I mean? Like it's not
Not
people
sexy
don't
at all.
people don't want to talk about it. People, have their own preconceived ideas about what it is. Cultural barriers, obviously, especially as a me as a Black African, I've really witnessed and experienced some of the cultural nuances that then affect people's perception of therapy, and they're very unique, I would say, to my cultural context. So you're speaking to somebody who's a Black African auntie, and she's 60 plus, and you're going to say, I think I'm depressed, and she might just say, maybe you should just pray about it, or maybe you haven't appeased the ancestors, or and things that really become hindrances for people to seek out help. So it's very complex, and yes, there is a deep seated passion around it. Sometimes I reference this story about losing a really good friend to suicide. That was kind of the thing that almost pushed me to really catapult this. And so it's very personal. It's a very personal thing, which I think is a good thing, but it can also be a bit of a drawback, right? Because sometimes I don't know when to stop. Sometimes I'm super invested in the person on the other side, what they're struggling with, and so that's why I think it's also important, obviously, most business people know this, to surround yourself with people with like complementary skill sets and ideas and whatnot, because you want to have like an objective view. A personal nexus is super important in building business, but you do need objectivity. And so I acknowledge that it's both a strength, but also a potential drawback. And I try to be intentional about the perspectives I get, or try and get around building my business.
Yeah, I mean, earlier on, when I started, I opened with some stats that the research is telling us around the mental well-being or mental health of entrepreneurs. And shortly, we will start taking questions. So I'll just ask our audience to submit their questions so that Onkgopotse can really, shed light onto some of the thoughts that you've had, or curiosities, the fears that you've had as well. But I started off the webinar with some stats, some really scary stats around what entrepreneurs struggle with, and you mentioned your own struggles. And in addition to this, we know that entrepreneurs struggle with, which I actually think it's quite a contradiction, is that a lot of entrepreneurs, actually the stats, let me pull out the stat here, says they struggle with imposter syndrome, and that it's very, very high. About 70% of entrepreneurs struggle with imposter syndrome, and yet what we see projected, as entrepreneurs, we see them as these courageous human beings who take risks, who keep going, they seem invincible. And it's very hard to sort of marry those two ideas, that someone can struggle with imposter syndrome or have a fear of failure, a massive fear of failure, but then still perform in the way that they perform. What has been do you have any experiences with that?
Oh my gosh, that's like my daily struggle. Yeah, if there's anything that I think I really excel at, it's self-doubt. But I think it's so true, because the appearance of like the successful founders, that they're super confident, they know what they're doing, they know what the plan is, they're on track to meet all their milestones. But I think that also then is a catalyst that brings about self-doubt, and the imposter syndrome. Like, okay, if I'm not meeting these milestones at this particular time, and if I'm not raising at this particular time, then maybe I don't belong here. Like, who am I to think that I can actually belong here? And I think as a woman navigating the tech landscape, there's a lot of us know the stats around VC funding, and I think there's something around 2% of VC funding goes to women-led tech startups. So you look at that, and yes, it's not the only mode to raise funding, but you're like, what are the odds that you're gonna be the 2%? And so it is very difficult. It's also difficult being in a space where for every event I attend, like a tech related event or focus group, whatever the case may be, a mixer, the ratio is probably like 1 woman to 8 men. So being in a space where there's so much kind of like otherness, but be that as it may, I think to some degree, I try and use that as fuel. So yes, I am doubting my ability to do this, but I want to prove myself wrong. Like, what if I can? What would happen if I can? And to use that as that fear of failure, or fear that I don't belong, as fuel. So really trying to reframe it in my mind, and also just like, there's a recognition that people anticipate that you won't succeed. Depending on your profile or whatever the case may be. So I try and reframe that as well, to be like, well, actually, I want to prove you wrong. I want to prove myself wrong, and I want to prove you wrong. But I think it's so important to be in a space where of community. The value of community is unmatched in the context of building a business, right? When you walk into a community and safe spaces that feel safe, you realize that you are not the only one struggling, and you're not the only one that doesn't know, how you're going to pay your employees tomorrow, and you're not the only one that is considering, considering going back to the corporate landscape because you're just so overwhelmed by the ambiguity, and just that knowledge goes such a long way, because I think it was something around 60 or just over 60 or even 70% of founders feel like the journey is lonely. And so that speaks to the power of community, because it can be incredibly lonely, especially if you're building in tech, right? Where you aren't necessarily required to be in a physical space doing, physical things, and your team is maybe remote around the world, around the province. So it's just you and your laptop and your thoughts and your phone. So it actually can physically be lonely. But then I think there's something around leaning into community, because there are spaces. There's an opportunity for you to create those spaces if there aren't. And really, you will see that there is so much value in community, not just in terms of like commiserating and whatnot, but also in terms of networking. There could be something that you're struggling with that somebody has a really quick answer to. So I would really encourage entrepreneurs to get plugged into communities. Be discerning, of course, around what kind of communities, what kind of advice you listen to, but create communities for yourself if there aren't any, because otherwise you will be, incredibly isolated.
Yeah. That's so powerful, Onkgopotse, and it makes me think about, again, partly why people struggled so much during COVID. It's because we are social beings, and the pandemic was a psychological affront to us because we are so isolated. We were actually created to be in community and to depend on each other. And you spoke earlier on about your curiosity on the nervous system, dysregulation, and the idea of, firstly, you learning the skills and the tools of regulating yourself when you are in that hyper aroused state is so important, and that is internal work that you need to do. You need to figure out, what is my window of tolerance. Where do I sort of operate optimally in? Where do I operate at my best? And how can I keep staying in within this window of tolerance and not be in a hyper aroused state? That's really important work that I think that our audience and our viewers should really consider doing. But secondly, to your point, that being with healthy relationships are actually an antidote to a hyper aroused nervous system. So healthy relationships actually help you as well to regulate your system. So really encourage, everyone who's in attendance to seriously consider those spaces. All right,
Yeah.
but we do have a question here. So shall we take this question? And it is from Zaine, and he says, what are some good strategies to build mental resilience, especially in challenging times? So shall I ask you, Onkgopotse, some
I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the answer to that.
your
I'm still trying to figure out my strategies, but I think mental resilience. I think it depends, right? So for me, I think it's one of the things is appreciating the value of rest. So I think it kind of speaks to like removing myself in increments from the chaos and whatnot to center myself. So when I was really struggling with anxiety, one of the things my therapist touched on was like grounding techniques. So really like the 5 4 3 2 1 method. You obviously know it, but just tapping into your senses to try and be present. So that's something I still use to kind of bring myself towards myself. And then I think also the second thing is relationships. Like you said, healthy relationships. I think when you have people pouring life into your, say, your vision, how much, celebrating the small wins with you, it really builds your ability to then like withstand criticism, and kind of be resilient when you're, getting 10 no's, or your sales growth is slowing. And when you have some people in your corner that are like, but do you understand that this, you accomplished this, and in spite of this? And so really people speaking life into what you're building. And then I would say the third thing I would say is also just like being mindful of your self-talk and being very intentional about it. I think the loudest voice it can sometimes be like the voice in our heads. And when you kind of begin to speak to yourself in a way that you would speak to a friend that you care about, you then begin to build yourself up, because people are always going to criticize you, whether you're a business person or not. People are always going to break you down, be it intentionally or otherwise. So if you are now building from a place of having built and consistently affirming yourself, for me, it then becomes quite difficult for people's criticism to shake you. There'll never be a time, let me speak for myself, where criticism doesn't shake you at all. But you have to then also keep pouring into yourself with those affirmations so that you can withstand and kind of balance out the external criticism you might receive.
That's so helpful, Onkgopotse, as a reminder, because I think that you are speaking about awareness, self-awareness, because in order for you to know how to respond or deal with something, you first have to be aware of how you're feeling. How is this feeling? Where does your mind go? What are your thoughts? That you actually have to pause and be aware of what's going on inside of me, because from there you can then say, okay, action mode. Let me respond. Let me let me try and address it. But if you don't allow for that self-reflection and learning to be self-aware, then you will really be asking for a solution that may not necessarily be what you need.
Yeah.
You may want a solution, but maybe that's not what you need. You need a specific kind of solution. And I think that's where, the work that I do, that's where it comes in, where it is about what are the key psychological skills that you are perhaps in need of, and how can we help you develop that, right? But it's not just in the one-on-one work that you do. You mentioned that you do therapy, but therapy is not for everyone, and it's not accessible, and it's not always possible. But I think that there is, there's stuff that people, especially in this age, where there's so much information, that people can start being curious about their minds, paying attention to that self-talk. Is it negative self-talk that drives you daily? Because a lot of people are unconscious to that, unconscious to the voice that actually drives their behavior, or the voice that actually drives their performance. And you want to develop that. But I also think what's important as well, which I'm also hearing that you're doing, is that injecting those small deposits of coping that eventually help you when you're in crisis. Because what you want to do is have a constant, process of filling up your cup, so that you, when a crisis hits, which is inevitable because that's how life is, we can't avoid stress. A crisis will always hit, and you will always experience a difficult situation. But it's about, what does it find you with internally? What resources do you have? And I think that's where people sort of struggle, is that a crisis hits and they have no, internal resources that they can respond to that. Rather, they react and not respond. And in entrepreneurship, there's often this, this statement that there's, you have to have what's your financial question, rather, financial runway. And I think the question that I'm posing today is, what's your emotional runway? Do you know what your emotional runway is, to our audience? All right.
Wow, I love that.
Cool.
I love that. Can I tweet that? I'll quote you.
We'll actually get back to social media. I was just about to say something, but we do have a question here. Letabo says, I love what you have said, Onkgopotse, about tapping into people's mental health blind spots. How does one go about discovering the blind spots so that they can keep themselves in check? How have you been able to do that?
Yeah, this is a tough one, but so I touched on, not like one of the challenges around being in the space is sometimes people don't know what they don't know. So like, how will you know if you're struggling with anxiety and therefore you might need help if you actually don't know what it looks like or what it feels like, or like, is there like a checklist? It's not as easy as like, that your business is profitable because there's a certain margin that you're making. And so I think one of the things we're trying to do is build in self-screening kind of tools where you check in with yourself, and it asks you a range of questions, and then it gives you a score. We like to think of it as almost like a well-being score, and we're still iterating on it, but to basically say, hey, you might be struggling right now, so maybe you should consider connecting with a therapist. Or, hey, it seems like you're doing really well. Maybe here's some resources for you to tap into to really just bring you into a sense of awareness. So I think that's one, those kinds of tools. The second thing I think is also like a lot of this is around awareness, right? So the second thing is also, creating safe spaces, relationships where people are attentive and attuned to you and your changes in behavior. So, one or two close friends that you can kind of, that can hold you accountable, if that's the right word, in terms of like, are you maybe going to gym less often than you used to? Are you engaging less in the chats than you used to? Are you coming across as super snappy lately? And surrounding yourself with people that feel comfortable enough to dissent, and then they can also then they lovingly and constructively point out those blind spots so that you can be aware that might mean that you're on the verge of burnout. And then I think the third thing is staying curious, right? Around building this resilience, mental resilience, and sense of well-being. I suppose for me, because I'm in the space, I mean, if you look at my algorithm on social media, or like everything is all around like mental wellness and whatnot. So that's a bit different. But I think if you are, we're curious about building our financial muscle. We're curious about building our, business owner mindset. And so we listen to podcasts and we follow, the Sam Altmans and the whatnots of the world. But it's important to also then realize that we need to build a repository of credible information around certain things, because that's the only way that you can also identify blind spots. So listening to podcasts around burnout, psychology, and the like is a good place to start, because then or reading books, or audio books, because then you begin to open your mind. I think for me, staying curious is so important, and the same way we're curious about building better muscle as venture, as we create our ventures around like how to increase sales, how to get to profitability faster, is the same way we should be holding ourselves accountable to building that muscle from a mental well-being perspective.
That's I really, really like that. Stay curious, be curious. And I think what I want to add, in addition to the self-research that you do, is also that you learn the most in relationships. And you want to cross-check those blind spots with with people in your life. Be curious. Why did I behave like that with this particular person? Why did I respond? Ask them, what are your thoughts? How do you think I responded today? How do you think how do you perceive me? Because I think people don't often do that. They actually don't often ask people questions. I remember there was a friend of mine who, when she went to business school, I think she called about 10 of her friends and sent out a survey about how people experience her, how people view her. And that really gives you a lot of insight around how you are experienced in the world as well, because there's you, but then there's you in relationship.
100%. Sure, that's so good. I think and I often sometimes we don't do that because we're afraid of what we might uncover. And that's why it's important to do it in safe spaces, because maybe there are truths that you know about yourself that you hope that people won't know about you, and you just really don't want to uncover those, because you may then be confronted with difficult conversations that you have to have with yourself, and then obviously with the people that you're in relationship with.
But the cost to that is that it keeps you in that space of not knowing, of just operating from your blind spots. All right, so we are at time, and I'm afraid we can't take any more questions. It just feels like we could have gone on and on, right?
I know. How did we get here so quickly?
Yes, but the last question I want to sort of pose to you is just to ask you, what is your relationship with the use of social media? Because it's very topical in terms of social media use and mental health. The reports that we're getting are not looking very good in terms of how we consume social media and how we use social media. So, as a parting thought, what are your thoughts around social media, and what advice can you give to our audience in regards to that?
Sure, this is a really good one because I'm still figuring it out. But I think what I've learned to do is to take breaks. So sometimes I'll delete Instagram, I'll delete, my TikToks, and just take a moment. I think what people also sometimes people don't also realize that LinkedIn is also effectively a social media channel. And for me, I think it that kind of also breeds some anxiety around, like, oh no, like this founder's raised this much and this. So I have to take breaks, and sometimes I do that by deleting the apps. The second thing I also do is screen time limits. I don't always listen to my phone when it tells me that I've only got 15 minutes left to be on a certain social media platform, but it does kind of remind me, if I've ignored it 4 days in a row, I feel bad. So, and then so I think it's important to just be intentional about managing your consumption of information from social media. And that may involve taking breaks. That has really worked for me. It's very difficult for me sometimes, but it has worked for me. I think it's also important to be intentional about the types of information that you're programming your algorithm to feed back to you. So for me, I think when I was going through a breakup, I was searching sad quotes and and then my algorithm was just feeding me breakup stuff, and so it was just a vicious cycle. So try and be intentional about that as well, because it matters. And just take a step back and be like, is this information that I'm now being fed helpful? And then reprogram otherwise. But I would say it's so important to take breaks. It's also super important to not take everything at face value. The same way we fact check if something happened in your current affairs is the same way we should also fact check if somebody is telling us something about how to manage our mental well-being, or because you want to be discerning in the era where anyone is a content creator and anyone is dispenser, so to speak, of information. And not everyone has good intention, and not everyone is qualified to be asserting their opinion on certain things.
Or selling courses, because there is a rise of the creator economy, but that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
Yes. But thank you so much for making time this evening and sharing your insights with us. I am sure that our guests have really learned a lot from you, and have appreciated your vulnerability and your openness to share and speak about this topic, which is often taboo. So thank you very much. We are at the end of our time, but I will see everyone next month. We have another webinar coming up, and I will be sharing more tools and resources around entrepreneurship during Entrepreneurship Week, which is in November. So have a good evening, everyone.